Thank you. Honourable guests, distinguished committee members, Bengal Institute, thank you very much for the invitation and wonderful hospitality to date. Keep it up. There were a couple of things in the previous speakers. One was this matrix of the future. And I'm wondering if the matrix of the future is in fact an overlay of the matrix of the past. And the second thing the Minister said is he said architecture was engineering and economics, but then he alluded right at the end of it's beauty as well, and I think beauty is probably the most important part of architecture. Coming from a sheep station, we had to move sheep through the landscape. And when the sheep come through a gate, they all follow each other. So, say if this lead sheep here, if this lead sheep's name is Trump, and it goes in the wrong direction, all those other sheep follow. And it's a bit like that, isn't it? It's a bit like that. So I'm very fortunate I've got several elders. One of them's here today, but I have several elders. The fellow on the left-hand side is Richard Laplastrian. That's in a 10,000-year-old cave, Aboriginal house. And the fellow on the right-hand side turned 80 2 weekends ago. And he's been my Aboriginal elder for the past 15, 20 years. And these guys teach you stuff. They've got a lot of knowledge, and women too, both sides. But if you sit and listen to these people, you learn a lot of things. When I was a kid, amongst other things, we used to climb trees. And when you're climbing a tree, you have to watch out where the branches are and they're big enough to carry your weight, and you've got to put your hand in the right spot. And all that sort of stuff. And your brain's working overtime, but so's your body. And so today the kids are climbing trees in a different way. So this guy's climbing, he's doing a tree climbing game. That's a big difference, isn't it? And that's a fundamental difference. When Whitefella landed in Australia, Australia was completely sustainable, 100%. And there was 1.2 million people there. It wasn't like just 20,000 people. And I suspect this matrix of Bengal, the Bengal Delta, was also sustainable. This is a burrawong palm. This seed here, if you don't wash it in water for 7 days and you ground it up and make a damper out of it, that's like a bread, it kills you. But somehow the Aboriginal people knew how to soak it for 7 days and make a damper. Knowledge takes time. You can't Google knowledge. It doesn't work like that. You Google information. So, what's happening to our basics? Fire, water, and food. This is in front of that Aboriginal cave, and that little blue berry there is a blueberry ash. And it's the highest incidence of vitamin C of any tree, and that tree is not endemic to the area, so it's foreign to the area. So someone planted that tree at the front of the cave. 62 people lived in that cave. And at the top of the cave was this big garden of plants. And my partner is a naturopath. And she said, they're all herbal remedy plants. It's found that this garden is 260 years old. In Africa, you can go to markets and buy herbal remedies and food plants everywhere. And you can ask the advice of the African elders sitting there as to what you need for a sore stomach or a toothache or whatever. Uncle Max took me into the bush once and I had a really sore tooth. And he went over to a tree and he took some sap and he put it on my tooth. Within half an hour, the soreness had lowered significantly. we are throwing away all this knowledge, or not recording it, or not using it, or not understanding it. These are some of the ingredients in our food. A dead body can last for 3 to 4 weeks in the morgue without touching it. 20 years ago, it could last 3 days. The reason it can last so much longer is because it's got this in it now. We were up in the northwestern area of Australia, which is pretty remote. And this is my daughter painting. She hadn't been to school yet, and so she had a freedom in her painting. As soon as kids go to school, they all paint the same way. But up until then, they have a great self-expression. But why I show this is because there was some stolen generation women there. And one of the stolen generation women, who was a great painter, this is her painting on the left-hand side, had taken a young woman out to the desert for 3 months. And I said, why were you doing that? She said, she had a lump in her breast and we were worried that it was a growth, so I took her out to the desert and we ate a certain plant every second day. And now there's a calcification over the lump and it's not going to grow anymore. So what we had in Australia was we had settlement by the white people, and they didn't see the country at all. They didn't ask the Aboriginal people what was the country like. They just went there and settled it. So we had 2 types of buildings, basically, or 3 types, but 2 types. We had a rural building, which are great buildings. Rural industrial buildings are fantastic, expressive buildings. But what comes with them is a misunderstanding of the landscape. And so you get massive erosion and changes to place and changes to drainage all around the country. The other thing we had was industrialisation, which we all have. And with industrialisation comes money, and with money comes greed, and with greed comes destruction. So at the moment, if you read that thing down the bottom there, it says that our Environment Minister supports this sort of technology for energy gain because he doesn't like ugly, noisy wind turbines. He prefers this. That's our Environment Minister. He's one of the sheep. So the 2 biggest resources into the future, water and food, unquestionably. Look how much fresh water we've got. Not much. 2.5 billion people are without sanitation in the world, good sanitation. And 1.7 million, it's 1.7 billion don't have fresh water. This is the recent collapse of the BHP mine in Marina in Brazil. 3.6 million people displaced. Many of them can't go back to their farmland. Mercury, arsenic and lead in the water. Irreversible damage. 3.6 million. Australia's the driest continent in the world, but the 4th largest consumer of water. Look at the cross-section through Australia. It's also the oldest continent in the world. It's like a set of old teeth. It's been worn down to the bone. So 40% of our continent is desert, but also 40% is original landscape, second only to the Antarctica in original landscape content. So land is our asset in Australia, and land is our educator. Aboriginal people, their whole basis for their spirituality and their self is preservation of the land, which they call Mother Earth. So I was brought up just on the edge of the desert, right next to the Salt Lake system, and you've got to realise that all the water in Australia drains to the centre, well, in the middle of Australia, 24%. And our Great Artesian Basin, which is the biggest basin in the world, is 65,000 cubic kilometres of water. Because our country's so flat, it floods. And we get a lot of rain quickly, so we don't have hills and mountains to guide it. And yet, on the right-hand side, that country flooded in 1974. A developer came along and put 360 houses on it, quickly sold them and got out of there, and it flooded again in 2009. More sheep. The first thing we did in building, or starting to build our house, is put a 50,000 litre water tank in. It was illegal 14 years ago in Australia to put a water tank next to a suburban house. Paul Folleris, who died recently, aged 62, an amazing gentleman of architecture, changed the whole face of sanitation in Aboriginal architecture in Australia. Went into one of the squatter camps in South Africa and repaired the toilets. This is an architect. This is last year. He saved on a daily basis 400,000 litres of water. It went from 365 people a day to a toilet to 70. I reckon one of the greatest architects that lived in our country. The other big resource is food. In Havana, in Cuba, up until tourism took over, every community was sustainable. These were their gardens. They were worked by the people in the apartments, and they had to because they couldn't import food. Totally sustainable communities. In fact, every country in the world was sustainable up to the end of the 60s. You could hardly say we're sustainable now. Australia has the last surviving disease-free bee population in the world. 70% of food is pollinated by bees. If the bees die, we've got 4 years of food left. This is called Roundup resistant corn. And it's called Roundup resistant corn, keeping in mind that corn, rice and wheat provides 70% of our calorie intake. It's called Roundup resistant corn because it's GM modified, which 80% of our food is. And it's been GM modified to resist the herbicide Roundup. So it gets sprayed with Roundup and survives. So we eat it all. 30 million tonnes of fish a year, fish being 10% of our calorie intake, 30 million tonnes are wasted every year. 30 million tonnes go into fish meal. It's a happy introduction, isn't it? This is a little school of fish, like the little tiny school fish that work together in a school to defend themselves against predators. It was found in Australia that around the sewerage outlets, these fish were breaking up and being attacked by the predators, like the kingfish and stuff. And they couldn't work out why. It was very uncharacteristic. Anyway, they finally analysed these little fish and found they were eating around the stormwater outlets, and they were eating the antidepressant drugs that were coming out of the stormwater. And it was disorientating them and breaking up their defence mechanism. 70% of the Amazon has been cleared for grazing. My son once said to me, "Dad, why do we clear forests?" And I went, I guess they're getting trees. And he said, "Don't they make oxygen?" 70% has been cleared for agriculture, and agriculture is roughly 20% of our greenhouse gas emissions. Patterns. That's what we're destroying, essentially. This is 1,500 kilometres of sand dunes in Central Australia. And this is a painting by an Aboriginal elder of that area. 150 kilometres square, this painting. One of my favourite paintings because it's so subtle. And there's this incredible understanding that dots make up the world. But apart from that, how did he know how to paint that from 10 miles into the sky? There were no planes or helicopters. Where did that come from, that painting, for an Aboriginal elder who walks the ground? So the Aboriginal people have a really acute understanding of their country, and they have stories about it, and the stories manage them to respect it. And when you have a respect for country, you design differently. You have to. You can't just get in with a bulldozer and dig it up. And if you draw these places, sometimes you see them a little bit better. Hopefully all you students and young architects are drawing a lot. No mouse, carbon pencil. Here's a pattern. I found this pattern in a river in northwestern Australia. Does anyone know what it is? Crowd participation? It's a fish trap. So they put the basket on the end here with the heavy rock so it can hold the fish in it. And they know when it's going to be active because they know in the waters in the river, and they know what sort of fish go what time of year. But they make a wavy line because if a fish hits a hard line, it gets frightened. So quite often you can look at a pattern and you can understand a place or an activity. And I think when architecture does that, it's remarkable. So here's a place, and we're going to look at four trees, which is a funny thing to do in an architectural lecture. But one of them's on the beach, another one's up the top of the hill here, one's just here in this sort of amphitheatre, and one's right on the point. So this is the one on the beach, where you've got the wind shear shrubs, the acacias, right on the foreground because the wind just hammers through there and it goes through the trunk of the tree, under the canopy so it doesn't blow the tree over. The next one up, which is this one here, is with the burrawong palms, that one of the seed pod we saw earlier. And all the trees work together. If you took 5 trees out of there, they'd all blow down like a pack of cards. The other one, the trees are working the same, but the wind is a lot fiercer. That's why they're that shape. And the last one just here, the trunk is about that big and the tree's only about that tall. It's the fiercest wind possible at the top of the cliff. Those 4 trees are the same species. Exactly the same species, the spotted gum. So the soil's different and the weather's different, so the tree's different. The soil's different and the weather's different, so the house is different. Or is it? This is our family property. You can see like there's a range here, Jackamaroo Range, Shuttleton Range, and the cultivated country finishes there, and this is a leasehold. So it means it's governed by someone else, which has been its saving grace, but it's desert. It's tough country. But it's really beautiful. And when you get to know one place, I think you can understand others. So if you understand a place like this, you can travel the world and look at places and start to see them because of their patterns. So this is me educating the kids out on the farm. This is a while ago now. They wouldn't fit on the bike now. The back one is an environmental engineer now. The middle one's finished his first degree in architecture and he's building our new house. He was in that photo. And the little baby one is a bit of a smart aleck, actually. This is some landscape on the farm, and I realised after I drew this that I'd used this bit of landscape in one of my buildings. Utzon always talks about landscape as reference. Nice way to talk about it. But it's desert landscape, and you can tell that because the water runs off the rocks up the top there, which you can see in section, and it hits the sand, and that's where the plants grow. And the plants are desert plants because they've got a big canopy that collects the water and directs it down to a taproot system. But the big canopy also shades the ground, stops evaporation. So you know when you look at those plants in Australia, we're in the desert. 12 inches of rain a year or less. And this is a desert spider. This spider goes down about 1 metre into the ground, and then where it's cooler, it's about 8 degrees cooler Celsius. And then it puts that little conical shape on its roof. And it doesn't put it on the roof to keep the heat out, because heat goes up, it doesn't go down. It puts it on the roof when it thinks it's going to rain, because it's flat in the desert and the water covers the flat floor. So the thing expands, seals, and he doesn't get water in his hole. This is Gilgaya country. It's the really low-lying country on our property. It's the Soak, it's the Murray-Darling Basin, which is smaller than the Artesian Basin. But it's where the Aborigines used to go and camp, because when it rained, the water collected there. But it's also where the minerals are. And so 7 years ago, we had a prospector come onto the property, because we've still got old prospecting licence laws, where you can buy a licence for $10 and walk onto anyone's property. And they found silver. They found 0.2 of a gram of silver for every tonne of earth, which was viable to mine. And so that's what it looks like now. Because the government gets 30% of the royalties, they encourage it. Now what happened was this mine went broke. It's 1 kilometre long, 500 metres wide and about 500 metres deep. The mine went broke, and that white soil there that's come out of the ground has got arsenic in it, because every precious metal is mined with arsenic. And so when this country floods, because it's Gilgaya country, it'll flood down to the Hay Plains and it'll kill all our farming land. And it does flood. This is a sandy creek in our property which has never flooded for 40 years, and it flooded 2 years ago. There were not fish, there were frogs in this. And I wondered to myself, where did those frogs come from? Like, who told the frogs the water had come? But I found out those frogs can actually bury themselves in the sand and live there for 7 years. We don't have winter, spring, autumn, summer. That's an English thing. In Australia, the Aboriginal people say we have anything between 3 and 11 seasons, depending on where it is. So this whole mindset of, when's winter coming? It's not. We don't get snow. We don't get winter. And patterns are made by people as well. And actually our traditional patterns were really beautiful. This is in Kenya. Pete, you know Kenya. Incredibly beautiful and very logical and very explanatory. And this is the wonderful Hakka villages in China. Heritage listed, World Heritage listed, like 360 people in one of these buildings, defence building, but also socially really well set up. So at the top, there were like family rooms. In the middle was where the grain was stored, out of the way of the rodents. And at the bottom were the kitchens and the temple. And the elders used to sit at the entry, which was just here, and look after the kids. But that's also the orientation for the prevailing breeze, so it could go in there and cool the whole thing. And the walls are like 1.5 metres thick, so they take the thermal mass and they take the heat out of the air. Now we drove down to these villages, which are about 2.5 hours south of Xiamen. Xiamen's in the south of China. And we know there's 25 million people living there, but we couldn't see any. We saw about 200 on the streets in the 2 days we drove there and back. And we suddenly realised they were living like this. There was row after row after row of this. And I don't think we've seen the social outcome of this sort of housing yet. I think we're making a huge mistake. You shouldn't live above 6 stories. Offices, different story. So this is the sort of nature of the housing in Australia. This is how the Aboriginal people live, because the landscape is so accommodating. We didn't really need to change the nature of our buildings, but of course we did. This is what most buildings look like in Australia now. That's facing west, so what does it require in order to be a little bit comfortable? the great demon of architecture, air conditioning. When I came back in 1990 from a trip around hitchhiking through Africa for a year, I thought, I've got to get to know my place better. And I spent every morning for an hour and a half on the water, paddling around Pittwater, watching the patterns for 8 years. Every morning. 4 things for me in architecture: space and light, connection, which I think is where we do vary from some other philosophies or approaches in architecture, structure, and the last one and the hardest one, mood. So this is a little house on Pittwater where we were kayaking, where you saw that kayaking, but it's a great example of, like, it's one of our first buildings, if not our first building, but it's a great example of our thinking and how we've continued. I mean, how does one advise young architects or guide one architects? I mean, I think, it's a really difficult time in your career, a young architect. It's not easy. What do I do? How do I do it? Who am I? So as a young kid, after graduating, I built most of my buildings, but the philosophy was to try and connect the building with where it was. Very simple philosophy. It wasn't sort of principle philosophy. So in this instance, we made a wet area downstairs which reflected the cave that was in the rock ledge just there. We made a middle level that had 3 openings on it, one to the bay, one to the waterfall, one to the rock ledge, and they all had different scales to them and different relationships. And then we made the top area a roof form that got the winter sun in and kept the summer sun out, and we dropped it down to the bad prevailing breezes. That's all we did to make a building. It's not really that much more complicated in my head than that. And so that's how it sits in the landscape. And this is how I met Uncle Max, the Aboriginal elder, because he saw this building like 18 years ago. And he phoned me up and he said, "Can I have a chat with you, young fella?" I said, "Sure." So I met him on this rock ledge here and he said, "How'd you do that building?" I said, "I don't know, I just respected where it was." And he said, "Thank you very much. Thank you very much for doing that." This is the service side of the building, single skin timber with all the services on this side, so they didn't interfere with the actual tower itself. And because it's so small, this building, a father and his son lived here for 15 years. Everything had to be doing a job, so the stairs were a seat and the window box was somewhere to lie in the sun, and it all connected you with where it was. And we had to experiment with light and shade in the simplest of ways. And when you finally climbed up the roof, the canopy of the building was light like a tree, not heavy. It was light. And that's why it was composite construction, so we could reduce the structure up there. And then more recently we did this wool shed. And being off the land, being a farmer, I guess, in my head, I understood the difficulty of these old wool sheds, which were traditional in Australia. No one had changed the typology of a wool shed in 180 years. And at the time I didn't think like that, but what creates change? What creates change? Like either unpredictable circumstance creates change, or daring creates change, or reality creates change. So we thought about this building, and the owner of this shed phoned us up and he said, "It's 38 degrees outside and it's 45 degrees in the shed. Peter, can you do us a shed that's at least the same temperature as outside?" So we thought about it. And the first thing we had to do is site the building correctly. How many of you have been to site and moved your building half a metre? I do it all the time because it's not in the right spot, truly. This building had to be in the right spot because the prevailing winds which came from the northeast on the other side of the mountain weren't coming from the northeast. They were coming around that hill and coming from the west. And if I hadn't been down on site and I hadn't felt that, the building would be totally wrong. Because what we do is we run water down these screens here, and we get the wind going through those watered screens and it cools the building. We have 9 sprinklers on the roof that we turn on in the middle of the day, caught from the ground. The water's caught from the ground, not from the roof, because the water from the roof is used for drinking and washing. And then we take the cool air from under the building, because the ground's always in shade, so it's cooler than the surrounding ground, and we direct that air past the shearers. With those 3 things alone, we get reductions in temperatures by 10 to 14 degrees Celsius. Ambient temperatures, no air conditioning. And we design the whole building based on function. So how you load and unload these sorts of things. These guys are the clients. They're some of the hardest working people in our country. They shear 200 sheep a day, bending over like this and lifting up sheep that are like 30 kilos. Really tough work. And they call this place the resort, which I thought was quite nice. These are the other clients, and we didn't have one complaint from any of these clients. How many of us can say that? But what we did with the sheep is, you can see there's that lowered ceiling. So it's a polycarbonate ceiling with lowered sides on it. We caught the heat from the sheep. We're all producing heat at the moment. It's going up there. We could catch it, put it down and heat the place, but you don't need to. But you'd have heat pumps and cool the place. We caught the heat from the sheep and we took it across to the shearers and we blew it down on the shearers, down through these 2-way fans just here. And we increased temperatures by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius in winter. So this is where, under here, we've got little pivot blades where we bring the cool air up from under the building. And there you can see the lowered ceiling. And it was with these simple techniques that we reduced temperatures by 10 to 14 and increased them by 5 to 8 in largely an open building. The walls were designed at the right height for a white bale of wool. All the doors and windows slid outside the building so sheep didn't get their feet caught. But it also develops an architecture. All this sort of logical, functional thinking develops an architecture. And then where the water runs down these screens for the cooling that goes in the side of the building, we put salt bush there so the sheep could eat it on the way up. It'd eliminate erosion on the ground, but also the wet salt bush would catch the dust from the yards and stop it going into the shed. So that's the water on the screens. Water from the ground, water from the roof. Water as valuable. And we developed our own tap system, which we've now patented. No, not really. It's just commercial. So the shed is really quite a simple building. The southern wall goes to the ground to stop the weather going in. We can store 2,000 sheep under the shed in the dry, so we can have 2 days of shearing. And the northern wall lifts itself up so we can get light underneath where the sheep sit, so it can dry out the ground, which has urine in. And we put a dust screen up the top of the building there to stop the dust coming in the north. How much do we need to do to create change? How much do we need to do to make a building? How much do we need to do? I suggest we don't need to do much. This is Aboriginal housing in Central Australia. The government spent, I think it's pretty obvious that the Aboriginal people like sleeping outside, but that's the building that's done for them in the background. The government spent $200 million on this housing, and at the same time they spent $960 million on this road, 21 kilometres of it. And it was designed for these vehicles here, whereas I think these vehicles here are going to be the vehicles of the future. So it's not designed with the future now and next, with the future in mind. And 1 year of fuel consumption, which I think is 10 billion litres, or 10 billion gallons, in America is equivalent to the entire energy use of Africa in 1 year. This is our first and only big house. And it's first and only because it created 27 skip bins of rubbish. Each skip bin could have produced another house, and it was embarrassing. This is housing in Alexandria near Johannesburg that doesn't produce any skip bins of waste. 36,000 people, one level high in 1 square kilometre. Our cities are really interesting because they're not thinking at all. They're not thinking about energy and not thinking about the consumption of energy. We have 340 sunny days a year, and we build a city like that. The energy consumption of the air conditioning alone is massive. 40% of the energy consumption of that city. If that was designed more sensibly, then we also do this sort of stuff. At the moment, we've got casinos dominating our thinking in Australia. I mean, I don't get that. And the casinos are designed so you're disorientated, you can't find the exit, and the light levels are the same as the day level, so you think it's daytime. That's how they're designed. That's the brief. This is the social environment in a high-rise building. Not a lot of relationships formed in a lift. But if we looked at, like, say, the termite mound, which is 1 million occupants, 21 degrees Celsius in Australia, constant temperature, very simple cross-section, maybe we could do buildings like that. Maybe we could look at these things and think, well, we could balance the temperature in a building really easily. I think the best cities in the world are about 5 to 6 stories. Copenhagen, London, Paris, St. Petersburg, all those cities. Because you can still talk to your neighbours. You can still look down into the courtyard and supervise the kids. You can still smell the flowers. You can still live socially. Copenhagen has this guy, Jan Gal, who's taken all the cars out of the central Copenhagen. And Copenhagen now is alive. You go there now and the streets are alive with people, which is how it should be. And our wonderful Lord Mayor, Clover Moore, a lady who's been in power for a long time now, has initiated the same thinking and got the same person into Sydney and Melbourne. And we're now starting to think of our cities in a similar way. So this is a development which has only just gone up. And we're actually doing a building at the end of the park just here, which is this building here, which is an old nurses' quarters. Heritage listed, I don't know why. I mean, they said to us the arches were heritage listed, so I said, okay, well, let's put big vaults in the arches. And we did, and we won the competition. A bit ironic, isn't it? But what we did, it was a nurses' building, so there was lots of modules. So we put the arches through at 2 levels high, so like as high as this ceiling up here, and we stripped everything out from underneath, so we made some beautiful big rooms. And that's really all we've done. 7 of them. And then up the other end, we made a really lovely, simple pavilion on the end of a heritage-listed building. And then we did a park in the middle, because I think outside environment is just as important, if not more important, than inside environment. And I was just talking to Marina about this morning. How important is the courtyard? What's happened to the courtyard? The courtyard was tradition for 5,000 years. And then all of a sudden it's gone. You know why it's gone? Someone put a roof on it and said, you pay extra money for that now. But it ventilated, it was life, it was garden, it was oxygen, it was everything, and it's gone. So we made an outside room and we won the competition. Much more like that little humpy you saw in Central Australia. And then we just struck a vaulted section through the middle of these vaults in the opposite direction and connected the whole thing up at the 2nd level. This is Singapore, and you can see, like in this high-rise city, how the air gets trapped. We had 22 students come to us and be taught in this environment from Singapore. And one night I was sitting next to one of the girls at 22 years of age, and she looked at me and there were tears in her eyes, pouring down her cheeks. True story. And I thought, oh no, she's had an accident or something. And I said, what's wrong? And she said, I've never seen stars like this in my life. And I thought to myself, how sad. So as Marina mentioned, we do a lot of teaching. These are the guys who teach. They're getting a bit older now. Glenn Murcutt, Rick DePlastria, Lindsay Johnson, myself and Britt Anderson. And we teach we teach several times a year. So teaching's as much as our work. And this is where we teach. And we teach about place and patterns and what I've been talking about. And we teach all around the world. This is Namibia. This is Chile with the indigenous people. We teach with all sorts of people, which is nice. You all know this guy. What a legend of architecture and a wonderful person. And we won a competition in Russia. And these are our clients. But they couldn't speak English and I couldn't speak Russian, so it was a pretty tricky job. But in order to win it, we had to come up with a design for minus 38 degrees Celsius. And just here is a big, oven. And that oven's used for cooking the food. And I suddenly realised it wasn't just for cooking the food, it was for drying the sheets, it was for everything. It was like a big radiator in the house. And so we designed, it was an international steel competition, we designed a big radiator in the house that had everything in it. It had the light fittings, it had the hot water systems, it had the showers, it had the stoves, everything. And then in the void spaces we put a special thermal rock. And then we took the heat out of that and we put it through the floor, which was a radiant floor, so it was a composite floor, timber and steel. And we retained 98% of the heat of the building. This is it here, what we call the thermal wall. And then we were able to capture the heat in the top of the building and put it back down into the wall. We even caught the heat off the car. And I got a phone call one day. I didn't know what had happened to this competition. I got a phone call one day, can you come to Russia? And I said, oh, at last they're building the house. They said to choose the colours. So in the time that we'd won the competition, and 2 years later they'd built this house without our attention. But I did say to the office, if we won this competition, we're going to go to Japan to see the opening of the house in Japan. So I had to spend all the competition money on going to Japan, which wasn't real smart as a businessman. But we had a wonderful client in Japan, and clients educate us. It's an amazing thing. Clients are our elders in many cases. This guy certainly was. He designed this jacket. And we always present in hand drawings because hand drawings communicate in a very emotive way. Computer drawings could be anyone's. Hand drawings, I can pick whose drawing it is. And the principle of the building was very simple. It was a wall to the street. The wall was a service wall. It was also thermomass, and it was also like a cave, emotionally, physiologically. But it also used the 86 degrees Celsius thermal springs to heat it and with heat pumps cool it. So that's the wall to the street. It's an urban street. On the left-hand side, we lifted the floor up a metre. We put a retaining wall in, so there's a sky room and a ground room to the building. Very simple stuff. And we put a diagonal ridge line through there to connect it with the landscape, connect it with place. Because it was a wall to the street, it was also a wall to the sun. We didn't need the heat, but we needed the sunlight. So we made a little skylight along the roof there where the timber joins the concrete, and we put a skin of water on the roof that you can drain off. And we bounce the sunlight into the building through that skylight. So it bounces onto the roof, but it also brings sunlight in winter, so you don't get the feeling of cold. And then we put canvas screens along this cave through here so that you could move the heat from area to area in the building. It's quite an open pavilion. And it's all single skin timber, similar to that first building I showed you, which I did when I was like 26. Many years before. And we located every room according to the place. So we put the calligraphy drawing room next to the sakura tree where it's silent and quiet. We put the bathhouse for 8 people next to the ocean where they could look over the ocean and be connected with the ocean. We put the indoor-outdoor room on the land so that you can walk in and out without having to go up and down steps. We connected the building with where it was. We designed all the fittings, tap fittings, light fittings and bath fittings. And it's very direct. It's a very no-nonsense building. Diagonal ridge line. Light changes the building. Not architecture, light changes the building. And it opens generously to the garden because it's the third member of a courtyard garden. And of course, God is in the detail. So you've got to do some detail, otherwise there's no God. So that's a light detail, and that's where the door closes. So the light goes either side of the door. But it takes the glare away from the globe. And then you can see the formwork on the ceiling that responds to the wall, etc., etc. Calligraphy ink in the floor. And the indoor-outdoor room that we do in all our buildings now, because mostly, let's face it, we like to live outdoors. And in Australia, all we need is shelter from the rain and the sun. In most countries, I'd say here too. That's the samurai house in the distance. So it just sits in the garden as a wall to the street. This is one of the first big buildings we did, which is the first building passively heated and cooled in Australia, over 2,000 square metres. This is a house we did where we entirely, it's 400 square metres, cooled and heated the house using this trom wall that we designed, which is 2 skins of glass and copper pipe pressed in the direction of the winter sun. We could get 56 degrees temperature water out of that wall, and we put it in the basement and had a heat pump and changed it from cold to hot water, summer to winter. And then we had skylights all across the centre there that we could open in summer and ventilate the house, and we could open the glazed ones. You can see there's 4 glazed ones in winter and get sun into the thermal mass of the building and heat the house. But what it did, all that functional stuff, is it also made the architecture. Because when you shut all the blinds on this side to stop the sun coming onto the thing and you shut the roof, it was a black room. And when you open the roof and you open the blinds, it was a white room. And variations in between. And we learned on this building the beauty of finish or no finish. And on this building here, we learned about the outside kitchen. This was for some chefs, and I said to them, would you cook outside? They said all the time. We put the outside kitchen in, and they cooked out there 80% of the time. And we suddenly realised how important a kitchen can be outside, and we do it on all our buildings now. You don't need to cook inside. And we designed it like a warehouse because people like living in big spaces. So we put just a room for storage of clothes and a room for bathing. And that was it. Oh, sorry, and a room for food. And then we designed this building here, which we designed like a cave or a concrete tent. And so the idea with this building, because the owner of this building is a very Buddhist Chinese doctor. And he came down the block of land and we were standing in the little shack that was there, and he looked at me and he didn't say anything. He walked off and he came back, and I said, so Tim, what is it you're after? And he looked at me and he said, just your best contemporary work. I went, oh, that's easy. Yeah. But all we did with that attitude was just provide the minimum of shelter on a rock ledge. So if you're on a rock ledge, what sort of building do you do? So it's very hard to discern whether you're actually still on the rock ledge or in a building. And on this building here, the people, there were 3 families that shared this building, and they said to me very early on in the piece, we live in the courtyard, we don't live in the building. So I actually designed them a courtyard they could live in. And those rooms on the northern side of the courtyard are secondary kitchen, storeroom, cellar, laundry, wash area, bathrooms, spa, all that sort of stuff. And they live in the courtyard. And this building here follows the landscape almost to a T, because there's a gully and a thick forest here, and there's open country and view out this side, and there's the mountain up here, so the building's reacting to each one of those environments. and it's almost like strolling through the landscape. And that's where I think connection is so important, because when you do connection, you do respect. This was an experiment in prefabrication. We built this building for half the unit price per square metre of buildings that were being built at the time. It's all prefabricated in a factory and brought onto site. And this was a cardboard house that was also prefabricated and built for $20,000. 2 tonnes on the back of a truck. This was an aircraft hangar where we experimented with that roof material that we'd used on the shearing shed that hadn't been used on a big building before. It spans, it's 1 millimetre material, it spans 20 metres and cantilevers 5. So it's a structure. So we eliminated all secondary structure in the building. We saved 34% of the cost of the building because all the secondary structure is gone. The roof is secondary structure. And on this building here, we used the rock that was already on site, the cliff that was already on site, as the wall of the house, and then we used it as thermal mass. So we put heat on it in winter and we stored the heat in that wall. And in summer, you can see there's a gap above the wall. We ventilated the wall in summer and we took the heat away. And there's no heating and cooling in this building other than the wall. And on this building, we experimented with the curved form, but deliberately, and it's on the cliff face. But we also experimented with how little can you do to finish a building. So we've got precast concrete panels on the outside and timber panels on the inside, and that's it. That's the whole format of the building. You can see the floor's just ground concrete. You can see it's exposed concrete finishes. This building, although it's in a very prestige area, was 2/3 the price. And then just to finish with, 2 houses. This is Invisible House, and it's on the highest ridge in Australia that runs through the East Divide of Australia. And the whole sort of, emotive balance of the house is based on one contour line that runs all the way through and connects you back with Sydney before it descends to Sydney. And the house is on that contour line, deliberately so. It's a 150-acre site, so we could have built anywhere. But it's also some of the worst weather conditions in Australia. We get down to -15 here and up to 45. It had to be a really tough house. So it's low against the hill. The roof wavers on the back of the hill because we wanted to bring Western light in a different way, but also we wanted to change the scale of that room. We had 2 skip bins of waste on this building. It was built over 3 years. The builder, who was 34 years old, did everything by the electrical and the hydraulics. He did all the light fittings. We used the formwork for the curved form there as the ceiling in these things here, which basically light scoops, scale changes and ventilators, like that. And we accepted finish as being the final product. So as it's built, it's finished. And the plan is very simple, but again, it's the outside room on either end of the building and in the middle. And the central wall is thermal mass, like the Russian house, but in a different way, shoe on the opposite foot. And we recycled all the formwork for the concrete and made our joinery and stairs out of it, because we're in an isolated site 2 hours from anywhere. And we put bathing right next to the fire, next to the opening, next to the kitchen, next to the bedroom. And then we had bathing upstairs as well, overlooking where you are. So we put romance into the house. And we changed the scale one end to the other by 1 metre and a bit. Same roof line. So 1 metre higher. And so there weren't many tricks in that building. And then this is the last building I'm going to show you. But this is a really important drawing for me, because this is the sort of drawing we do before we do a building. It's the drawing of the land and the way the water flows on the land and the way the building sits on the land, or the platform on the land, and how the land is and how we respect the land. And the owner of this building came to us And he said, I want you to build me an art gallery. I said, I don't think we're going to be able to do that. It's a residential area. He said, no, build it as a house, but I'm going to give it to the nation when I die. Incredible man. He's got the best Asian collection of art in Australia, and he's going to give it to the nation when he dies. So we had to design this building knowing that one day it was going to be full of art, and this is the art courtyard. And then we wanted to close the building down to the morning light, except for one window to his bedroom. And we wanted to change radically the section of the building so the lower level opened to this courtyard and the upper level opened to the garden. And so the building actually dealt with the old cut on the site. And then the northern side, because it's facing east, you only get sun from the north. Well, you get your main sun from the north. That's where the double height was, so the sun could penetrate the building, but that's where the living was, and that's where the ground was. And that's where the freedom was. So it opens to the west on this side, to the east on that side, and to the garden on that side. And the columns are so big because they all match with the joinery, but they've all got services in them. Hydronic heating is in the columns, but also service ducts that pull the heat from the roof and put them back down in the basement. Big fans. And the shaft of light is to change the balance in the room as it moves from one side to the other. So that's the other side of the house, quite different, but linked by a cross-section. And very quickly, this is where we live. This is where we've been living for 2.5 years. It's a tent, $5,700 from South Africa. True story. And it's been wonderful. It's re-educated me about living. And you've got to have minimal possessions. You've got to get rid of all that stuff you don't need. Except for the telly, because I like the rugby union. But you can put the bath in the garden. That doesn't have to go in the tent, as long as the neighbours aren't watching. And we have chook yard down the back, we have veggie garden and organic orchard, and then this is where we cook on this fire here. Not every night, but most nights. And it's hard work, but it's beautiful food. And we live next to 28 apartments. And they're very delighted that we built this and not another block of apartments. And none of this is possible without a wonderful group of supportive people who happen to be the office. So I honour them and thank them, and I thank you all very much. That was almost.
Yeah, well, thank you, Peter, for a wonderful presentation. Okay. I'd like to invite Mr. Khair to come and present a small memento to Peter.
Is it money? Oh, wow. There's a map of the world. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so a few questions, all right? Okay, a couple of questions, please. Yeah, okay.
Any tutors?
Intruders, trespassers, burglars, policemen, anybody, you know.
Yeah, no, we have intruders, but if there's nothing to steal, they don't come.
In all the designs?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
No, but you know, those buildings lock as well. You know, they're shown as open, but they do shut. In fact, the last two buildings you saw on remote sites where you could have lots of intruders. But they shut down, and what I find with architecture is if it's noble enough or interesting enough, people tend to shy away from it and not touch it. They rob houses that they know. Touch wood.
Okay, thanks.
It's gone. But our tent doesn't lock, and we've never had anything go from the tent. And there's 28 flats next door. And there's all the people who ride surfboards on the hill. Any other questions?
You grew up in a rural environment, which is all organic, completely and totally organic. The moment you do architecture, you introduce inorganic material. So, isn't it difficult to create a kind of an environment which, is there a loss of memory in the process?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think how do you go from now till next? And part of the logic that, I think you can take two attitudes to that. One is that life is impermanent, and so you design and make it like that. But the other attitude is point in time, or history is permanent. And that means you make a building that could be there for 400 or 500 years. I actually think the problem with our buildings these days is that we don't think of them as permanent. We don't think of them at all in that sense, either as impermanent or permanent. We just make them. And I think when you make them as permanent, then, the house we're making for ourselves at the moment is designed to last a minimum of 400 years. So, on the basis that if you look at traditional architecture, a lot of buildings have been up for 400 years. And I think it's only in the last 50 years that buildings have been designed to last 50 years. And so there's all that resource and all that energy and all that personnel that's just thrown out and wasted. So I think, the thinking has got to be good behind the building. It doesn't have to be a great work of architecture, but it does have to be a building that works and is flexible enough to change into the future. And in terms of memory, I think that buildings, not just materials, but I think that buildings accumulate memory. And I can go into a building that's quite old, like the Pantheon, for instance, and I can feel the history of that place.
That means memory is not time-bound. It's a shifting memory.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's one of the things we've got to be very careful of as architects, that we don't disorientate memory. And hence I showed you that building that I said was a cave on the side of a bit of sandstone in the cliff. That's a cave building on a cave site. It's accumulating the memory.
One would like to design like that.
Sorry?
Is it possible? One would like to design like that, an architect. Maybe to design purely with the organic material is basically designing a cave.
But we're all given different opportunities. And it's all very well me looking over there at that opportunity, but I've got this one.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Are we okay? Thank you.